A lonely drunkard thought his life was over, until he found a billionaire's little daughter crying in the dark. One night of courage unlocked a chance he never imagined. But what happened next will change everything forever. Stay tuned because you are about to watch a beautiful story and find out what happened next. Hello, family. Welcome to Tales Haven. Kindly subscribe to my YouTube channel for more interesting stories. Thanks you as you do so. Sit back, relax as we dive into the story. Brian Carter was once a proud man. He used to work as a carpenter, building beautiful wooden furniture with his hands. He had a wife named Laura and a little daughter named Emily. His life was simple, but it was full of love. But everything changed on a rainy night 5 years ago. Brian was driving his family home from a birthday party when a truck ran a red light and hit their car. His wife and daughter died that night. Brian survived, but his heart was broken beyond repair. Since then, he couldn't find the strength to keep working or caring about anything. He felt he didn't deserve a future when his family had lost theirs. So he began to drink, hoping the liquor would numb his pain. Every evening, he went to the old grocery store on Miller Street, where he would sit against the brick wall with a bottle in his hand. People passing by would wrinkle their noses at the smell of alcohol and dirty clothes. Some would cross to the other side of the street just to avoid looking at him. Brian noticed it all, but he didn't care. He thought he deserved to be invisible. On that particular night, the wind was colder than usual. Brian's hands were stiff, and his lips were dry. He hadn't eaten anything all day, but he was too ashamed to beg. He pulled his brown jacket tighter around him and stood up, thinking he would look for a quiet place to sleep. He walked slowly through the dark streets. Most houses had their lights off. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under his shoes. As he passed the old town park, he heard a faint sound, a soft, shaky crying. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him. But as he took another step, he heard it again. A child's sob. Brian's heart thumped hard. For a moment, he thought of Emily, his daughter. She used to cry like that when she was scared of the dark. He looked around carefully. In the dim light of the street lamp, he saw a little girl sitting alone on a wooden bench. She wore pink pajamas with tiny white hearts on them. Her feet were in soft slippers. A thin, shiny ribbon was tied around her blonde hair, and on her small wrist was a bracelet that caught the light. Brian forgot about his hunger. He forgot about the bottle in his pocket. All he saw was a lost child who needed help. He took a slow step closer, not wanting to frighten her. "Hey there," he called out gently, his voice rough from years of drinking but still kind. The girl flinched and wiped her eyes. She looked up at him with wide green eyes full of fear. "I won't hurt you," Brian promised. He held up both hands to show he meant no harm. "I just want to help you. What's your name?" She sniffed and rubbed her face. Her voice was tiny. "I'm Sophie." "Hi, Sophie," Brian said softly, kneeling down so he was at her eye level. "Are you all alone out here?" She nodded, and fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "My daddy, he was in the car. I went to get my teddy bear. Then the car drove away." Her voice broke, and she hugged herself tight. Brian's chest hurt with sorrow. He understood what it felt like to lose someone. He knew the fear of being left behind. "Don't be scared," he said, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I'm going to stay with you until we find your daddy. You are safe now." The girl looked at him, studying his tired face. Even though he smelled of alcohol, something in his eyes made her believe him. She nodded slowly. Brian carefully took off his brown jacket and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Better?" he asked. Sophie nodded again, holding the jacket tight around her small body. Brian sat on the edge of the bench beside her. He didn't care that people might see them and judge him. At that moment, none of it mattered. He was no longer just a drunk man trying to forget the past. He was the only person who could keep this child safe in the dark. And for the first time in years, Brian felt a reason to stay awake, to be strong. He didn't know it yet, but this cold night would be the start of something that would change his life forever. Brian sat on the bench next to Sophie, gently patting her back as she cried into his jacket. The park felt colder now that he was sitting still, but he didn't mind. He watched the road carefully, hoping a car would pull up to look for her. Minutes passed and no one came. Sophie shivered, her teeth chattering. "Are you cold?" Brian asked softly. She nodded. He looked down at his thin shirt and then back at her. She needed warmth more than he did.
"Hold on," he said.
Slowly, Brian stood up and walked over to the tall bushes near the path. He picked up an old newspaper someone had thrown away. He returned and tucked the paper around her legs like a blanket. "It's not much," he said, "but it will help a little." Sophie looked up at him, her eyes wide. "Thank you," she whispered. Her small voice made his heart ache. "You're welcome," he said. "I had a daughter, who was about your age." Sophie blinked up at him. "Where is she?" Brian swallowed hard, feeling the memory cut deep. "She's not here anymore," he said softly. Sophie didn't ask more, and he was grateful. He knew he couldn't just sit there waiting. She needed real help. He had no phone, no money, and no idea how long she had been out in the cold. "Can you stand up?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded again. Brian took her small hand in his rough one and helped her to her feet. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice trembling. "There's a gas station at the corner," he said. "It stays open all night. They have a phone. We'll call someone to come get you." Sophie squeezed his hand tighter. "Will you stay with me?" Brian looked at her and nodded. "I won't leave you. Not for 1 second." They walked slowly out of the park, her tiny feet shuffling against the sidewalk. Brian walked carefully, making sure she didn't trip. As they reached the corner, the bright lights of the gas station glowed ahead. He felt a small wave of relief. Inside the station, a young man with glasses stood behind the counter. He looked up in surprise when he saw Brian and the little girl. "Can I help you?" the clerk asked, eyeing Brian's torn clothes. "Yes," Brian said, steadying his voice. "This little girl is lost. She needs help." Sophie pressed closer to Brian's side, clutching his jacket around her. The clerk nodded and picked up the phone. "I'm calling the police right now." Brian led Sophie to a bench by the window and sat her down. He crouched beside her, keeping one hand on her knee so she wouldn't feel alone. "Would you like some water?" he asked. She nodded shyly. Brian turned to the clerk. "Can she have a bottle of water?" "I don't have any money." The young man looked at Sophie and softened. He reached into a fridge and pulled out a small bottle. "Here," he said kindly. "No charge." Brian twisted the cap and held the bottle to Sophie's lips. She drank slowly, her hands still shaking. The clerk hung up the phone. "The police are on their way," he said. "They should be here in a few minutes." "Thank you," Brian said. He sat back down beside Sophie and took her hand again. "See," he said gently. "Everything will be okay." Sophie rested her head on his shoulder, and Brian felt her body relax. She trusted him completely, even though they had only met an hour ago. As they waited, he looked down at her soft blonde hair. For the first time in years, he felt useful, like he was doing something right. Outside, headlights appeared in the distance. 2 police cars slowed and stopped by the curb. A tall officer stepped out, followed by another in a dark uniform. Brian stood up slowly. "She's here," he said quietly, pointing to Sophie. The little girl blinked at the lights, and then gasped. "Daddy." A man in a black suit ran past the officers and into the gas station. His face was pale, and his hair was messy. "Sophie," he shouted, his voice breaking.
"Daddy."
She flew off the bench and straight into his arms. He lifted her up, hugging her so tight it looked like he would never let go. Brian watched, his heart full. He remembered holding Emily like that, and for a moment it hurt to breathe. But then he felt a tiny bit of peace, knowing he had helped this father keep his child. The man kissed Sophie's forehead again and again. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair. "Thank you for staying safe." Brian took a step back, feeling out of place. He turned to leave quietly. But before he could slip out the door, the man looked up with tears in his eyes. "Wait," he called. Brian froze, turning slowly. You stayed with her?" the man asked, voice shaking. "Yes," Brian said simply. "She was alone. She needed someone." The man held Sophie close and looked at Brian with deep gratitude. You saved my daughter's life, he said softly. I will never forget this. Brian stood frozen near the door. He felt like he didn't belong in the bright gas station anymore. He looked down at his worn-out shoes, ready to slip away into the night. But the man in the black suit took a step toward him, still holding Sophie in one arm. Please, the man said, voice low but firm. Don't go yet. Brian looked up, unsure what to say. I'm Richard Bennett, the man continued. I own Bennett Enterprises. Brian nodded slowly. He had seen Richard's face in newspapers on the ground. He was one of the wealthiest men in the state. I don't care who I am right now, Richard said, shaking his head. All I care about is that you stayed with my daughter. You kept her warm. You kept her safe. You didn't have to, but you did. Brian felt heat rise to his cheeks. He wasn't used to praise. I only did what any person should, Brian said quietly. No, Richard said, his eyes filling with tears. A lot of people walked past her. You were the only one who stopped. Sophie looked up from her father's shoulder. Her small voice broke the silence. He sang to me, she said shyly. So, I wouldn't be scared. Richard closed his eyes, breathing shakily. When he opened them, he looked at Brian with so much gratitude it made Brian feel even more uncomfortable. I want to help you, Richard said. Brian shook his head quickly. You don't have to do that. I know I don't have to, Richard replied gently. But I want to. He shifted Sophie to his other arm and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a business card and held it out. Please take this, he said. It has my direct number. If you need anything, food, a place to stay, work, call me. Brian stared at the card but didn't reach for it. I'm not someone who deserves charity, he said, his voice cracking. Richard stepped closer. This isn't charity. It's respect. You protected the most important person in my life. For a moment, Brian felt tears burning behind his eyes. He hadn't heard words like that in years. He finally took the card with a shaking hand. Thank you, he whispered. Richard nodded. Where do you stay? Brian looked away. Behind the old grocery store. Richard frowned. That's no place for any man, especially one with your heart. I'm fine, Brian mumbled, embarrassed. But Richard was already looking at one of the police officers. Would you please drive Mr. Carter to a hotel tonight? Put the room on my account. Yes, sir, the officer said respectfully. Brian's eyes widened. No, I can't. Richard raised a hand gently. Just for tonight. Please. Let me know you are safe. Brian looked at Sophie, who was watching him with tired, trusting eyes. Okay, Brian finally said in a low voice. Just one night. Richard smiled. Thank you. Sophie wiggled down from her father's arms and walked over to Brian. She reached up and wrapped her small arms around his waist. Thank you for finding me, she whispered into his jacket. Brian felt his throat tighten. Slowly, he laid a hand on her soft hair. You're a brave girl, he said, his voice thick. Your daddy loves you very much. Sophie nodded. Then she let go and stepped back to her father. Richard bent down and kissed the top of her head. Then he stood straight and looked at Brian with respect. I hope this is not the last time we meet, he said softly. Brian didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. The police officer guided Brian outside to the waiting patrol car. As he climbed into the back seat, he looked through the window one last time. Richard was standing there in the doorway, holding Sophie close, watching Brian with eyes that seemed to see all of him, his pain, his kindness, his hidden worth. For the first time in a long while, Brian felt something warm spark in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he believed. As the car pulled away into the quiet night, he held Richard's business card tight in his hand. Brian sat quietly in the back of the police car as it rolled down the silent streets. The warm air blowing from the heater made him feel sleepy, but he fought to keep his eyes open. He kept glancing down at Richard's business card in his hand, like he was afraid it might vanish. When the car finally stopped in front of a small but clean hotel, Brian felt nervous. He hadn't been inside a place like this in years. The officer stepped out and opened the door for him. Come on, sir, the young officer said kindly. Mr. Bennett has already paid for the room. Brian climbed out, clutching the card. Inside, the lobby smelled like fresh coffee and lemon cleaner. The man at the front desk gave him a polite smile, though Brian could tell he was surprised by Brian's worn clothes and tired face. "Room 12, the clerk said, handing him a plastic key card. "There's hot water in the shower, and the kitchen can bring you food if you'd like." Brian nodded, too embarrassed to answer. He took the elevator up, his heart beating fast. When he pushed open the door to the room, he stopped in the doorway. The bed was covered with a white blanket that looked softer than anything he'd touched in years. There was a small table with a lamp and a clean bathroom to the side. He walked in slowly and shut the door behind him. He set Richard's card on the nightstand and sat on the edge of the bed. His hands were shaking. It had been so long since he felt safe anywhere. He wanted to wash his face, but when he looked in the mirror, he barely recognized himself. His beard was messy, and there were lines on his face that hadn't been there 5 years ago. He took a deep breath. Just one night, he told himself. Tomorrow I'll go back to my spot behind the grocery store. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. The next morning, Brian woke up to sunlight pouring through the curtains. For a few seconds, he forgot where he was. Then he sat up quickly, realizing he hadn't slept on a real bed in years. There was a gentle knock on the door. "Housekeeping," a woman's voice called. Brian cleared his throat. "Just a minute." He washed his face and combed his hair with his fingers. When he opened the door, the hotel manager stood there with a large envelope. "Mr. Bennett asked me to bring this to you," the manager said. Brian thanked him and shut the door again. He sat at the little table and slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on thick white paper. "Brian, I meant what I said. You are not invisible. You are a good man. If you are willing, I would like to help you rebuild your life. Come to my office anytime. You will always be welcome. With respect, Richard Bennett." Brian felt tears rising in his eyes. He set the note down and took a deep breath. He knew he could just leave. He could disappear again, go back to hiding from the world. But then he thought of Sophie's little arms around his waist and her voice whispering, "Thank you for finding me." He picked up the business card and read the number again. His hands still trembled, but for the first time in years, it wasn't fear that made them shake. It was hope. 2 hours later, Brian stood in front of the tall glass doors of Bennett Enterprises. People in suits walked in and out, glancing at him with curious eyes. He almost turned around, but then he remembered the way Richard had looked at him, like he mattered. He took a steadying breath and stepped inside. The lobby was bright and full of plants and artwork. A woman behind the front desk looked up and smiled politely. "May I help you?" she asked. I have a meeting," Brian said, his voice low. "With Mr. Bennett. Your name?" "Brian Carter." The woman's eyes softened. "One moment, please." She picked up the phone and spoke quietly. Then she looked up and smiled again. "Mr. Bennett will be right down." Brian's heart pounded as he waited. A few minutes later, Richard appeared, wearing a navy suit and a warm smile. "Brian," he said, striding over. "I was hoping you'd come." Brian swallowed hard. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted. "I'm broken." Richard shook his head.
No.
"You're a man who saved my daughter. You're a man who still has something to give." He placed a hand on Brian's shoulder. "I don't expect you to be perfect," Richard said gently. "I just want to help you start again. Will you let me?" Brian looked into his kind eyes. For the first time in so long, he felt like maybe he could say yes. He took a slow breath and nodded. "I'll try," he whispered. Richard smiled wider. "That's all I ask." As they walked together toward the elevator, Brian felt something lift from his shoulders, a heavy weight he had carried alone for too many years. Maybe the past would always hurt. But now, he was finally stepping into a future he never believed he deserved. And this time, he wasn't alone. Brian followed Richard into a bright office with tall windows overlooking the city. Sunlight poured across the shiny floor and touched the framed photos of Sophie and her father on the walls. "Please sit," Richard said kindly. Brian sat in a soft leather chair, feeling nervous. He looked down at his hands, which were rough and scarred from years of hard work and hard living. Richard sat across from him, folding his hands on the desk. "I want to be honest with you," Richard began. "I know you have been through a lot. I don't expect you to trust me right away." Brian nodded, his throat tight. "But I believe people can change," Richard continued. "You proved that night you still have goodness inside you." Brian's eyes stung, but he blinked fast so the tears wouldn't fall. "I want to offer you a job," Richard said. "A real job. Not because you saved my daughter, but because you have shown strength, even when life was cruel." Brian swallowed. "What kind of job?" Richard smiled. "Security. We have several buildings that need night guards. You already showed you can be calm and protective under pressure." Brian looked up, his heart beating fast. "I haven't worked in years." "I'll help you," Richard said firmly. "We'll get you any training you need. You'll have a uniform, a place to stay, meals, and fair pay." Brian tried to speak, but his voice broke. He pressed his hand over his mouth, fighting back the wave of emotion. Richard stood and walked around the desk. He placed a steady hand on Brian's shoulder. "You matter," he said softly. "You deserve dignity." Brian nodded, his chest so full it hurt. "Thank you," he whispered. I don't know how to thank you." "Live well," Richard said simply. "That's enough." A month later, Brian stood in front of the mirror in a small apartment Richard had arranged for him. He wore a Navy security uniform with a silver badge on his chest. His beard was trimmed, and his eyes were clearer than they'd been in years. He picked up his work bag and turned off the lights before locking the door. When he stepped into the lobby, Sophie was waiting with Richard. She ran to him and hugged his leg. "You look like a hero," she said brightly. Brian smiled, his eyes warm. "Thank you, Sophie." Richard reached out and shook Brian's hand firmly. "Ready for your first shift?" Brian took a deep breath. "I'm ready." As he walked out into the fresh morning air, he felt lighter than he ever thought possible. That evening, as he sat at the front desk of the Bennett office building, Brian watched the sunset paint the sky orange and gold. He thought about all the nights he'd spent alone behind the grocery store, wishing he could disappear.
Now he was part of something again. He was trusted.
He had purpose. 2 weeks later, on his day off, Brian visited the small cemetery where his wife and daughter rested. He brought fresh flowers and knelt by their grave. I think you'd be proud of me," he whispered. "I'm trying to be better." A breeze lifted his hair, and he felt, for the first time, that maybe they were listening. 3 years later, Brian was still working as a security supervisor. He had saved enough money to buy a little house on the edge of town. Sometimes, he would have dinner with Richard and Sophie, who still called him her hero. On the anniversary of the night he found Sophie, Richard invited him to a celebration. As the guests gathered, Richard raised a glass and looked at Brian with gratitude. "This man," Richard said, his voice full of feeling, "reminded us that one small act of kindness can change everything." Brian smiled as everyone clapped. He felt no shame, no fear, only peace. And in that moment he knew the truth. He was no longer a man lost in the shadows. He was a man who had found the light again. That brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you do, kindly subscribe to my channel for more stories, like, and share this video to your friends and loved ones. Thanks for watching.